Hi, this is Robert Shear with another edition of Shear Intelligence, which for much of 6 years was broadcast on NPR station KCRW, made widely available that way. Now, in the age of Trump, NPR is no longer quite so open, and so I'm doing this now through Shear Post, which I also edit. It's available on Spotify and Apple and all sorts of things. So it hasn't hurt our reach, and but it relates to this question of the new censorship, and it relates to the arena that I think is most vulnerable and yet, in many ways, the most important uh, under the rubric of academic freedom. And that extends also even into the high schools and what you can teach. Gavin Newsom in California just signed a bill that has to abide by the ADL standard of what is anti-Semitism, which is quite limiting. Whether you can talk about any of these issues now, and of course these uh, top universities have some of them have already made deals with the Trump administration to get more government spending and so forth. So the reason I'm here to talk to Professor Henry Reichman, who is taught at Cal State University in East Bay, Hayward, is that he is probably the best authority we have on kind of the history of the battle over academic freedom. He's written some very important books. He's been the point person for the American Association of University Professors in fighting to preserve academic freedom. I'll put up a list of his work, but I just want to throw it to you right at the beginning. You went to Columbia as an undergraduate, right?
Yes.
Yeah, they were the first to cave. And let me put just people say I go on too long with these introduction, but at that risk, let me just add something. It seems to me that the Jewish people in their history, my history, which is a history certainly of dialogue, debate, disagreement. There were jokes about it, how many opinions you would get, and so forth. The whole tradition is one of debate. They're using protecting Jews as the spearhead of this fight on academic freedom. And there's a lawsuit right now against UCLA that seems to have some uh, weight behind it with the Trump administration, saying the university didn't do enough to suppress demonstrations. They called the LAPD, but so why don't you take it from there? Where are we on this issue of academic
Well,
freedom?
first of all, Bob, let me thank you for having me on. It's by coincidence, I get, well, not really coincidence, I guess, because this is absorbing a lot of my time, is just this morning, I was working on a major report for the AAUP about precisely these agreements that the universities are entering into. I've drafted a very long section about Columbia's experience and was just this morning writing about UCLA. And you're right. I mean, there has been this attempt to weaponize anti-Semitism uh, in order to uh, in order to reach goals that really have absolutely nothing to do with anti-Semitism or the fight against it, but are an attempt to control what is taught, who can teach, and basically whatever goes on in our major research universities. I give you an analogy. Uh, you and I, and you more than I actually, well remember the McCarthy era. And it's been said that in the McCarthy era, communism, especially once the Communist Party had always been relegated to almost irrelevance, that in the McCarthy era, communism was less the target than it was the weapon used to silence people on the broad left and even well into the liberal center. And I think that's what we're seeing now at these universities that the fight against anti Semitism has been weaponized as a way of silencing all sorts of thought at the universities about the issues that have nothing to do with anti Semitism, transgender, for example. in ways that prioritize the rather, I won't even call it conservative, you have to call it reactionary views of the current administration. And of course, as an alum of Columbia, I was and still am deeply offended and distressed by the university's capitulation, even as I understand that I'd hate to be in the position of running an major American university where there's basically, you're being held up by extortionists who, who are holding, in Columbia's case, it was billions of dollars in federal grants hostage in order to compel the university to accede to its demands. So it's a very troubling phenomenon, of course.
Well, what it's amazing about it is, again, it's really feeding the worst anti-Semitic trope, right? Which is that somehow Jewish people would want to have power and over other people and deny their religion, their ideas, or so forth. And they represent, this was the idea of, rich Jews, and they, Wall Street, even, not even Hitler, for instance, in the rise of fascism in Germany, anti-Semitism fed into a notion of grievance, right? And Jewish bankers and so forth. And the irony here is that Jews remain and consistently, year after year, and not only in this country but throughout the diaspora, in the most progressive ranks on any issue, including foreign policy and including, I would even suggest now, criticism of Israel. It's really quite amazing if you look at particularly university professors or young students like in New York supporting Mamdani. You find a very large number of young
Oh,
Jewish people.
this is for sure. And
Yeah,
in fact, I mean, at Columbia in particular, and Columbia, of course, is in some ways almost unique. UCLA is similar, I think, in some ways, but Columbia especially, being in a city with such a large Jewish population, but also a very large Islamic population, at the crossroads of commerce and everything, with a significant number of both Jewish and Muslim faculty members. And we've seen there that significant statements by not just a handful, one or two Jewish faculty members, but broad statements from broad groups signed collectively by groups of Jewish faculty members, abhorring, first of all, of course, the Trump administration's efforts, but also the attempts by the Columbia and Barnard administrations to silence criticism of Israel in the name of campus safety, in the name of protecting against discrimination, and they've been in many respects in the lead. And it's rather remarkable. Columbia appointed this commission on anti-Semitism to try to see whether they could find how to deal with anti-Semitism on campus. And in their faculty, they had experts on anti-Semitism in Jewish studies, and that's not who they appointed to the commission. Instead, they appointed people known mainly for their political Zionism, their
yeah.
right wing political Zionism, I might add.
But I want to take it to the larger issue of academic freedom because even in harsh times like McCarthyism, or even in overtly totalitarian countries, as we saw with the Arab Spring movements and all of that, this is the place where, in very repressive societies, there's an outburst of freedom. There's ability to complain, to reason, to think, to challenge. After all, you go back to the whole Socratic tradition, it's questioning, challenging, right? And and it's interesting because you mentioned the McCarthy period, where I guess both of us came up during that period. There was no shortage of strenuous, profound debate on the campuses about everything, like the nature of capitalism. At Columbia, you had people like C. Wright Mills, right? Or on on any issue. What they're asking for now is something that is really unprecedented. They it's not just that they want you to pledge allegiance to the flag or not burn something or do this or something. They want you to endorse a view of American exceptionalism, of what the definition of freedom is. They want you to apologize, not only apologize, embrace a society in which three rich men have as much wealth as half of the population, deny class. And so one of the contradictions here in that mayor's race, for instance, you had some, 23 of these billionaires, right, supporting the rare candidate who challenged all this. And despite that, and thanks to a lot of Jewish voters, particularly young Jewish voters, in a city that still has, as you point out, a very large, there was this historic win. Uh, right? So there's a kind of when I when looking for a little optimism here, and maybe you can help me.
Well,
I
okay. Let me give you some optimism, but But first, you just said a lot, and I want to address a couple of elements of it. One is, I think you're right that what we're seeing is unprecedented. In the 1950s, there was a stultifying environment that the universities, of course, are always the been and hopefully always will be the bastion of free thought, even when it's half underground in the universities. And of course, in the 1950s, as you say, there was continued debate, but there was a stultifying atmosphere in society as a whole, spread to a number of institutions. But there was never a organized, coordinated attempt, especially through institutions of government, especially the federal government, to actually direct and control not only who teaches, but what can be taught and even what must be taught in ways that we now see today as part of the program of the Trump administration and its allies in state governments like Florida, Texas, etc. Um, and that that is troubling. Another difference also is that universities, both private and public in the United States, have always been dominated by boards of trustees that represent what back in the 60s we used to call the establishment. Uh, Marxist terms, the ruling class, but the wealthy, the highly connected, etc. Back in the 1920s, Upton Sinclair, wrote a devastating book about showing how all these boards were interconnected with big Gilded Age capital. And that was certainly true of institutions like Columbia in the 1950s and 1960s. That said, however, the level of wealth inequality we've seen today and the growing privatization of many university activities, the increasing dependence on private donations and on government approved grants, etc., have given the Bill Ackmans and the Elon Musks and all those types of wealthy billionaires a sense of power on boards of trustees that is, while perhaps not unprecedented, certainly far more extreme and extensive than we'd seen before.
they're not
Now,
embarrassed.
let me get to the optimism,
Yeah, yeah.
though.
No, no, but
the
let me make a
opt-
point. Let me just make a point there. What is so odd, I interviewed Nelson and David Rockefeller. I covered these people, wrote about them. They would be embarrassed, even if they wanted, they believed this, to be so blatant in their use of power. The Rockefeller commissions and everything, they always had to have a rainbow of different views. They always had to show, no, we can criticize ourselves. This is just blatant. We're going to destroy anyone who gets in our way.
No, this is a different. It's an interesting discussion going beyond academic freedom. This is a different kind of capital than say the Rockefellers, or at least the second and third generation Rockefellers, uh, represented. But I wanted to get to the optimism part because I think it's important to recognize that, especially in university campuses, These initiatives are not going without are meeting resistance. And one of the things that has me so optimistic, I was a vice president of the AAUP for 6 years from 2012 to 2018. I chaired its Committee on Academic Freedom and Tenure, arguably it's certainly its oldest, but also it's arguably its most important committee for 9 years from 2012 to 2021. And during that time, we would always see an ebb and flow of membership, et cetera. But to be honest with you, despite our best efforts and the group that I came to leadership with in the AUP, we were organizers. That's the kind of people we were. And despite our best efforts, membership was at best growing slightly. Uh, but I think in the last 5 years or so, and certainly in the last two, certainly the last one since Trump came into office again, we've seen a dramatic growth. I mean, AUP membership has grown from by 25%. Now has over 50,000 members and growing rapidly. And the biggest growth has been not in our union chapters where the collective bargaining agreement usually assures that you're going to have a major proportion of the faculty be your members, but in institutions where they do not yet have or legally cannot yet have collective bargaining representation, yet those chapters are growing. I mentioned to you earlier before we went on the air that at Columbia, where when I was an officer, I tried to get a chapter restarted. Columbia was one of the places where the AUP was founded in 1915. Edward Seligman, the professor of economics at Columbia, was one of the main authors of the historic 1915 AUP Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom. Uh, for years, they'd had no chapter anymore. I tried to get one started again. I couldn't. Well, now Columbia chapter is alive. Not only alive, it has 400 members. It's the largest non-collective bargaining chapter the AUP has in the country. And we're seeing this place after place. Every Ivy League school now has an active chapter. And of course, at all the smaller schools, public institutions, community colleges, we're seeing activity like we have never seen before. And so that gives me hope and optimism. The other thing that gives me hope and optimism are the students. And, you know, they've been subject to the students who fought, set up those encampments in support of, uh, in opposition to Israel's policies in Gaza, whether one agreed with it fully or not. Uh, One had to see that this was a generation, much like the one that I experienced when I was in college in the late 1960s, and that we'd seen around apartheid and other movements over the years, that was stepping forward to, sorry about that. Sorry about that. My phone went off. Um, the we've seen we hadn't seen that kind of activism in years, and they've been subject to incredible, terrible repressions. But yet, I still think that the fact that students are still being active about such things, that they're taking on political debates, they're interested in things, and yes, just like people like me did when we were in college, now they're going to make mistakes. Uh, Take some positions that maybe later they'll think we're foolish, but so what? They're students, and that's what students are supposed to do: learn, and you don't learn without making mistakes. So I'm optimistic on those two counts.
Let me ask you a question. When I look back at this whole long period, it seems to me the protest movements of the 60s, and you say it was based a lot in how, uh, boring as well as repressive, how dull the dominant culture was, how predictable. And so it was allied with the music. And I just did a podcast with Grill Marcus, who documented all of that so effectively in his own work. But what is happening now, it seems to me, is a repudiation of the compromise that was worked out at the universities, or the sellout is a better word than compromise, to handle the protests of the 60s. And that was to economically reward the faculty. And that you have a situation where at your leading universities, particularly if you're in the business school or something like that, the movie Inside Job has those great scenes interviewing all, well, not all, but about five or six of the top business school deans, including Columbia, where these guys can make millions, consulting and what have you. But just generally, if you're a tenured professor at any kind of leading university or even at a major public institution, you're estranged objectively from the reality of most people. You have no job insecurity. You can, at some of these schools, make upwards of $300,000 a year. You might have a spouse who also can do something like that. The workload is not excessively heavy. And I just looking back on it, one of the things I refer to that because we're not getting a lot of objection from leading secure tenured faculty. The irony in that is that tenure was defended as a way of giving you job security so you could be free and independent in your thoughts and have academic freedom, have job security. So now maybe you don't read it that way, but I
Well,
see.
I actually don't, although there are some aspects of it. I think it's true there has been, but there was in the past, by the way, too, always an elite of the faculty. And of course, this society increasingly in the last 40 years or so, in all spheres of endeavor, has been sort of funneling rewards to a smaller and smaller segment of whatever group it may be. I mean, the kind of superstar approach to things. But on the other hand, however, I think it's important to recognize that what we've seen and what has made universities so vulnerable, and which I will say, I do think even the most elite faculties, maybe not so much in business schools or law schools, although even there, are beginning to recognize it has been this erosion of the faculty as a collective body. And tenure, yes, tenure is supposed to protect academic freedom. I mean, 1940 statement on academic freedom and tenure that the AUP and the Association of American Colleges agreed upon said that tenure had two functions. First, it was to protect the academic freedom of the faculty to teach, do research, and speak as citizens without institutional discipline. Second, to provide a basic level of economic security for the profession as a whole. Those, however, were rights that could only be enforced and achieved collectively by the faculty as a whole. And by the late 1960s, early 1970s, some 67 to 75%, depending upon how you calculate it, whether you include graduate student workers or not, were protected by the tenure system. Uh, However, since then, tenure has been not so much, they made a number of, and there are again today, making a number of frontal assaults on tenure like they're doing in Texas. But tenure has basically eroded to the point that now some 25 to one quarter or one third, depending again how you calculate it, of the faculty are only that group is protected by tenure anywhere. And most of the faculty are on contingent appointments, a significant number of them just temporary 1 year appointments, class by class, etc. And when that group, first of all, those people have effectively only the academic freedom that the institution is willing to grant them. They don't have real protections for it, except insofar as either they are protected by a union contract or they have tenure. Usually it's the combination of the two that is most effective. Um, and as a result, as well, that because they're such the majority of the faculty, increasingly the minority of the faculty that is protected tenure has less and less power to enforce their tenure. And that's one of the things I think we've seen at a place like Columbia, where when I went there and I would talk to people, I'd say, "Well, we have academic freedom. Everything's cool here. Don't worry about us." And now suddenly they realize that they have no power at all because the they are, even within their own institution and within the academy as a whole, they are an increasingly besieged minority. Maybe not besieged yet economically, although there's that too, especially in disciplines like the humanities and social sciences, as opposed to the more lucrative professional fields and some of the physical and natural sciences. Medicine, of course, is a whole other ballgame. But and I think that's more what I see. I think that there was a kind of deal, as you said, made in the wake of the '60s demonstrations with regard to students. That, if you recall, the early 1960s, we started rebelling in the 1960s. We rebelled not only against the politics of the time, the Vietnam War, the civil rights issues, but we were also rebelling against the in loco parentis policies that so many universities have. I remember when I was at Columbia, there was a young Barnard woman who was kicked out of the university because she was living off campus with her boyfriend in sin, I guess you know. And we weren't allowed to have a member of the opposite sex in the dorm room except for a few hours every other week, with a open door, etc. And the deal that was made, I think, by a lot of universities is they pulled back from that sort of in loco parentis, gave students more rights in that sense, and thought that they wanted students to be comfortable, to have a good. And then, of course, as universities became more and more dependent on tuition and less on especially public universities, on state allocations, more and more they're treating the students as customers to be pleased. Um, I think that deal has broken down because clearly there's a different sort of in loco parentis where they're sitting there and not telling people who they can have sex with, what music they can listen to, etc., but they're telling students what views they can express and what views they can't.
This just raises, again, looking at people might say, why are these two old coots looking for optimism? But I think the fact of the matter is people don't act if it looks so hopeless that you're going to lose. And you have to, if you're really serious about organizing, you have to think of, how would we all benefit or be hurt by not acting? This is the critical thing. And what's happening is Trump is an embarrassment. And the policies, the ones that we're describing, which didn't start with Trump, and they won't end with him, but they're now identified with him. I mean, the awkward thing, and I think it happened in New York, that if you take a very simplistic, jingoistic position that whatever Israel does is right by definition, you'll alienate a lot of smart Jewish people who are unhappy, who are Jewish, who are unhappy with what Israel's doing. They might not say so publicly, but they know that for Netanyahu's closeness to Trump is quite revealing of the inadequacy or the danger of both of these men. And so it seems to me there is an organizing opportunity, and it relates also to being in the multinational world. The great coinage of American foreign policy power was we stood for freedom, and we could trash others. Say China, they may be being very productive now, but they don't have freedom. And now, like on a lot of these campuses, you have thousands of Chinese students who no longer, even if they felt that way to begin with, and maybe their parents wanted them to come here because they thought this was a better way of organizing life somehow than a centralized party or what have you, that it's been torn to shreds. That, wait a minute, who are the good guys? And I think, I don't know, you're somebody who was on campuses a lot. But I think what happened in Berkeley when you were there, I happened to also be there, was that people like Mario Savio were able to expose the hypocrisies of the corporate state and its relation to education. That money was talking. It wasn't just the boards of regents, it was these powerful, rich people with their grants and so forth that denied class in America, denied grievances, denied we had any real problem, right? A few
Hmm.
maverick professors like C. Wright Mills challenged that, but that seems to be what's happening now. If you have 23 billionaires who are telling you that New York can't be run by some dangerous radical who believes in rent control or, people eating properly, it exposes the folly of that enterprise. But more important, it shows they're out of touch with the world. I mean, after all, you had the UN meeting about Gaza, and it was an embarrassment to support Netanyahu there, no matter where you were coming from. So, isn't that something that happened in the 60s?
Well,
Suddenly,
I think so. I think certainly part of the reforms that happened in the universities were that the United States was compelled, as it has been multiple times in its history, to sort of wrestle with its image of itself and what it has been striving for, and what it sometimes really is. And I think that's been now shown in the starkest form it's been since certainly, arguably, since the Civil War. Um, and uh, and you're right. Um, I also think an interesting thing about the universities right now is the more that this Trumpist MAGA movement and the government, its administration and the state governments, the more they turn into this sort of narrow, internally looking ethno nationalist ideology and turn their backs on the world. I mean, what else is there? Trump wanting to erect tariff barriers is nothing more than that. I mean, the great strength of American universities has been that they are international. I mean, heck, it's not just even the elite research universities like Berkeley, like Columbia, like Harvard, uh, or even the major state universities where scholars from all over the world and students from all over the world come. But even the so called lesser or teaching institutions, I mean, I taught at Cal State East Bay, we had a significant number of international students from China and other countries studying there. And why did they want to study? Because we had the best education system in the world, from top to bottom, with all its flaws and faults, which, believe me, I spent much of my life trying to highlight and fix. And yet now, if we're going to lose all that, we're going to lose all that. There are international scholars all over the place now who either left the United States and left American universities or are seeking to leave, or ones who would have come who now won't. And I think the longer this continues, the steeper that price will be. But I think it's a price that hopefully the American people and maybe even some elements of the American elites who aren't like this new brand of billionaires we were talking about will see it in the way that, as you pointed out, the Rockefellers would have seen it some 50 years ago.
well, but the thing about the Rockefellers, and you say the third generation, Nelson Rockefeller, not that far removed, but still, you're right, and David Rockefeller, they had the wisdom basically first trumpeted by Franklin Delano Roosevelt that capitalism could not survive in that raw, exploitive, selfish, excessive manner, that it had to improve its act. And what has happened now is all the illusions have been stripped away. And take a city like New York, which is an illusion. Oh, you'll work hard. You get to a place like New York. You have a talent. You'll get ahead. No, you won't. You won't even get an apartment. You'll be crashing on somebody's couch. When you were at Berkeley, that illusion was real. Had some reality. You could drop out of Berkeley like a Mario Savio and still get a good job and reinvent yourself. Maybe you did that. I don't know. But the job market was different. And the education you got helped prepare you for that market. But right now, we have become the Hicks. I'll give you one example which relates to the university. I read South China Morning Post every morning. It's owned by Alibaba. It's an old Hong Kong sort of oriented paper. But I used to be in the China Center at Cal and tried learning the language, but I didn't keep up with it. But I've been following China forever. China has gone from being a very closed society, not that different than North Korea, that we think of now, to a situation where China is actually embracing the free market in its best sense. For one thing, they've changed their travel policies. It's very easy for people from some 70 countries to go to China without visas or to very easily get a visa. It used to be very difficult. They are encouraging students to go abroad. They understand, for instance, these scientists that feel excluded in the United States, some of them leading mathematicians and physicists, now have institutes created for them in China. So they're doing what wise post World War II American capitalism did. It branded itself as the center of freedom and diversity and so forth. Now it's China saying, well, we're a multipolar world. We can get along with Saudi Arabia. We get along with India now. We get along, Uzbekistan, whatever have you. United States is in the narrowest, most primitive sense of xenophobia and nationalism, and as you point out, alienate these foreign students. So I want to my mind, the optimistic thing here is that capitalism or modern society in general only succeeds when it's open. The slogan of the open society, when it's accessible, when it can be challenged, that freedom actually works. One reason why you need separation of powers is so you don't have one President King screwing the whole thing up. So I wonder, you know, whether you feel that way in any way. I just, uh,
No, I think that's basically right, and I think it's also true, by the way, in university governance that universities function best when they're the least restrictive on the ability of the members of the university community, by which I mean both faculty and students, to pursue knowledge freely. That doesn't mean that universities are going to be debating grounds for every crackpot idea. Academic freedom isn't the same as freedom of speech. Freedom of speech protects your right to say things that are blatantly stupid and wrong. But academic freedom does not allow a professor to get up and say things that are blatantly stupid and wrong in their discipline. They can't, you know, my favorite example is, of course, there was at Northwestern University an electrical engineering professor, Arthur Butts, who was a major Holocaust denier. He never brought it up in class, so they didn't bother him. There were calls for them to fire him. He didn't get fired. He taught electrical engineering. Of course, if he'd been in my job teaching modern European history, there would have been good reason to fire him, just as there would have been good reason to fire me as an electrical engineering professor if I started saying crackpot ideas about electrical engineering that would blow up the world. So, so academic freedom is
but
not
wait,
quite the
let me
same thing
stop
as
you for a second.
yeah.
The issue is not, the issue of the moment is not whether such a person should be fired. The issue is whether his colleagues fire him, his peers fire him, his students get to register their complaints. The university gets to consider
I agree. I
what,
agree.
and
Yeah, no, I
and
agree. The real question is for academic freedom
well, let me just stress that a little bit more, because what you've had is worse than McCarthyism. McCarthy was never the president. McCarthy was a person who was attacking the president, attacking the military. You now have a situation where the dominant political force in the country, the imperial presidency, through its hacks on Congress and their hearings and everything, saying you are not allowed to say A, B, C, D. This is
yeah.
not, this is not about crackpots. This is
No,
about
I
who.
understand. I understand
Yeah.
that. I understand that. But I was trying to make the difference between academic freedom and freedom of speech, which I think sometimes has gotten eluded. But I do think that the question of getting back to your point about that freedom really works. That the universities don't work as universities if they are not if the faculty and students are not free to explore for themselves and govern themselves on academic matters. And I think that there's examples. I mean, German universities under Hitler, they didn't do anything. I mean, I was a scholar of the Soviet Union. Soviet universities, they did some very excellent work in physics, etc., but they were not free. And I think the importance of an open institution where debate, which of course you want to value civil debate, etc., but where debate difference, sometimes impassioned, can take place is key. And without that, a university is not a university. And I think the point you're making is without that, more broadly in the society will not flourish.
But let me say what I think is happening. And I outrank you in age, so I'll just do this.
Not many
No, but
people do anymore.
no, but seriously, I think what's involved now is the attack on the very idea of liberal arts education. And because it's seen as, and this really goes back to David Horowitz, who has inspired a lot of this sort of right wing ideology after having been on the left, but he also was not very tolerant of other people ever. But the fact of the matter is, they there's a movement about really, do you need questioning? Do you need deeper thought? Do you need to challenge assumptions? And the one reason I left engineering and went off to get enough so I could end up teaching some economics in college was that they what's happening now, and this is what maybe is a good way to end this money business. And the reason Columbia did sell out so rapidly, and now Cornell evidently, and Penn and others, is the administration and the people who want to control things are basically saying, if you'll be a good boy or a good girl and focus on what you're supposed to be doing, engineering, and help us build bigger weapons or help us fleece the public with financial schemes like Lawrence Summers with Wall Street, if you will do this stuff, it'll be very good for you. This is Trump's deal. We're talking about a lot of money, and we'll spend more. But at the prices, we're going to divide and conquer. The prices, you're going to have to shut up those other people on your campus, the dreamers, the people who think about different ways to live, who even defend the right of a transgender person to or a gay person to reinvent notions of marriage and love and so forth. And the deal that's being offered is basically an appeal to corruption rather than any idealism, which is we got a lot of money and we're going to let you do any research, anything, all even if it isn't productive, as long as it's not threatening. And that means
Well, yeah, I think that's true. But on the other hand, I also think it's a sucker's deal because when we've seen the attacks on the liberal arts, on gender studies, ethnic studies, on all sorts of critical thought in the humanities and in the social sciences, now we're watching it bleed over into the natural and physical sciences, around climate change, uh, around evolution, around vaccines, etc. And one of the interesting phenomena I was mentioning before, and this is of course another reason I think for optimism, if we want to close on optimism, which I hope we will, is that not only have I witnessed recent years this tremendous growth in the AUP, but whereas in the past, AAUP chapters used to always, almost entirely be dominated by people in the humanities and social sciences, increasingly we're seeing people in the hard sciences and uh, even engineering. That they There's a great new guy who's the head of the Texas conference of the AAUP, who's been invigorating that conference under very difficult and repressive conditions. He's an engineer. The current chair of the Columbia chapter of the AUP is a mathematician. So I do think we're seeing that yes, that there is that element. You're absolutely right, corruption is the word. Well, corruption runs through everything these monsters do, but I do think we are seeing, and particularly in sometimes only in pockets, true, and unfortunately not at least visibly in university administrations or boards. But we are seeing pockets of people who say, I don't want that deal. Because in the end, that deal not only is going to screw my friends, it runs the risk of screwing me too.
Yeah. Well, we're going to see because, the sad story Germany, when Hitler rose to power, was a society that many intellectuals in the world admired most. It was certainly a society given to deep thought, respect for the arts, actually had a better record on treating minorities than most of the other European countries. There was a lot of contradictions. At the end of the day, this thing, the corruptions of money, power, fear, uh, carried it. One of the ironies of focusing on Palestinians and anti Semitism, we've never really, and you would know more about this than I do, you've taught closer to it, but going back through my own education, never really was exposed to much of a serious discussion about how fascism came to power in the society that was most like the United States. It was the source of the largest group of American immigrants. My father happened to be one of them. And how did it happen there? Now, fascism has nothing to do with Palestine, has nothing to do with the problems in the Mideast. It is a Western European phenomena in the way we talk about fascism. It had a lot to do with class. It had a lot to do with imperialism. But the main thing was it had to do with how do you buy off. This was where I think you and I were exposed to some very interesting ideas in our younger days. Because the big word on the campus then was "don't sell out." Don't sell out, and it affected the music, it affected the lifestyle, and everything. Now, objectively, it was easier not to sell out because there were better jobs and there were, public education. You could go to Berkeley for next to nothing. What does it cost now? UCLA or Berkeley? It's about half of what a high flying Ivy League school charges, right?
And even worse in the professional schools. My wife went to Berkeley Law School and paid what, 700 something dollars a semester or something like that. Now it's like something like 40,
Yeah.
50,000.
Yeah. So, selling out is what the whole thing is about now. And if you really want, it's a good way to close, because what we're really concerned about is this country going to go fascist? At least that's what I'm concerned about. And I think it's a real concern because, it's interesting. It's ironic. I grew up with a German father who, had a strong accent, and my mother was Jewish. My father came out of a Lutheran background. But as a kid, I always wondered how did all my German relatives get involved with this nut Hitler, this comic crazy figure. I wonder whether Trump ever really ever in his life thought about that. His grandfather, his father, he shows no sign of it, because if you thought about it, you would realize how absurd it is. Absurd to center the argument about anti-Semitism on a land grab in Israel of the West Bank and Gaza, and somehow make that the initiation of anti-Semitism.
Oh,
Uh, Anti-Semitism has to do with the most powerful scapegoating the most vulnerable, right? That's what the lesson of it was all about. That is not taught anywhere. It's not examined anywhere. And you would be fired, correct me if I'm wrong, if you seriously investigated that now. And in California, this progressive governor who makes his, going to probably get to be president if he effectively challenges Trump, just signed a bill saying that you have to accept as a definition of anti Semitism criticism of Israel. That's the issue.
yeah, the
And
IHR this IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which even its own author Kenneth Stern says should not be used in this way at all.
Well, but it raises a very serious point about what is education and what is the value of liberal arts education. The reason I switched, finally stayed an extra year at City College uh, to change, not that I disrespected engineering and I was good at it, but it seems to me if you can't have a society on every level, not just people who go to college or graduate, about what this idea of the concern of the Constitution was about, the fear of power. Why even these guys who had wigs and who now had a country and had beaten the empire still enshrined a notion of limited government. Imperfect as it may be, we all know that. But the matter of fact, the core of it, and certainly for the amendments was to deny anybody having these levers of power, including the church, religion, or anything else, and going their way, right? And ironically, the key, somebody know people don't talk about it much about the First Amendment, the establishment clause is the opening sentence of the thing. And it says the Church of England or any other religion cannot be defined by the government to dominate the society or tell people what to think. These divisions within a religion or so forth are essential. Now you have a demand for intellectual obedience, even in the state of California, so where you have taught. So if you're now at Cal State University East Bay and you dare to challenge the ADL's definition of anti Semitism, you would be fired, tenured or not, by that
Well,
law.
hopefully you wouldn't, because it still has to be tested, but we will see.
What does that mean? Isn't that what people said in Germany? We will see.
I know, but the thing is, um,
It's
well,
law.
whatever.
It's law. Isn't it the law that Congress passed? Isn't it
What?
that that's the definition of anti
Yeah,
Semitism?
but whether, well, we'll see. I think this fight is hardly over. So let
I'm
me
not
put it
saying
that
it's
way.
over. I certainly hope it's not. What I am saying, okay, we've gone long and it's an interesting discussion. I think there's a danger that we're underestimating the nature of the debate here. Again, invoking my older age, when McCarthy was doing his number, and I, in some sense, was on the receiving end, so I have some familiarity. In most respectable circles, and that probably was 95% of the leadership of Columbia on every level, he was a boob. He was crude. He was a danger, right? And he had to be contained. And people from the President Eisenhower on down felt that. And Eisenhower's brother was the head of a university, right? And argued that, and so forth. What you're getting now, and it's a different kind of capitalist in Silicon Valley, you're getting people that say, We are the knowledgeable. The rest of the mass, and that includes folks like you and me, we shouldn't be listened to. We're dangerous and stupid, and we don't know what works, and we can't make the society powerful and rich again. That argument is something we didn't face back in the 60s. No one had the nerve to present such an argument.
Yeah. I think that's true, and I think I mean, and I think there's just two things to emphasize. Again, one is I think you're absolutely right. The stakes of this are far higher than anything we've ever seen, and it isn't a foregone conclusion that American democracy will survive, and that we will not be some version of what might well properly labeled a fascist state. On the other hand, I think there is at the same time good reason to believe that that's not at all inevitable. And so the reasons for both, I mean, the very reasons that we have to be optimistic are because the stakes are so high.
Yeah, I'll join you on that one. And by the way, let me applaud you for being one of the key figures in the country in the academic world who has actually championed academic freedom when it was at risk way before Trump was the major source of at risk. No, I mean, and so how do people get your work? How do they look into the AUP's work? I mean, we can post things and, and bring up your own articles, tell us what to read. We'll make links to it.
Well, I if some where I'd love people to start is I have a little book that Johns Hopkins University Press published. First edition was published in 2021, but so much happened in the next couple few years that earlier this year in 2025, March of 2025, we published a second edition that basically goes traces events up to the inauguration of Trump, second inauguration. And it's available from Johns Hopkins University Press and at the usual places where people buy books. Try to write fairly regularly for the AAUP's Academe blog. The AAUP has its own website, aaup.org. You can learn a lot about the organization. We have this blog where members of the AAUP participate. I'm one of the co-editors, and that's at academblog.org. I post things regularly there. And if anyone listening to this is a college professor, or for that matter, a college or university student, uh, check out if there's an AUP chapter on your campus. And if there isn't, you can go online and join. We even have, we now call the at large chapter for members who are not part of an organized campus chapter yet. Also includes retired members like me. And I'm actually the president of that at large chapter right now, in which I see my main job is to try to help people who uh, join the AUP not knowing whether there's a chapter on their campus to help them either find it or start one. So, so
You also publish. Yeah, we should mention again. The book is called "The Future of Academic Freedom," originally published by Johns Hopkins Press in 2019, and expanded. Then you have your
well, there's two
closing
books. There's that one, and then Understanding Academic Freedom.
Understanding Academic Freedom, which was also published in turn. And then you have a second expanded version. And then this other one, which I haven't read, but I'll mention it, was on censorship and selection issues and answers for schools, published by the American Library Association. And there's three editions of that. So,
Well, yeah,
yeah,
that's a little. It may be out of print now. I'm not sure, but I actually got my start doing a lot of this academic freedom work. Doing back in the 1980s, I was academically unemployed and got a job at the American Library Association in their Office for Intellectual Freedom. Learned a lot there. I only was there for 9 months, but then They hired me after I left to go do research and then got an academic jobs. They hired me to edit their newsletter, which became a was a periodical every other month. I edited it for 35 years, and in the course of that, I ended up writing this book, issues and answers for schools about school and uh, book and school library censorship issues. And I retain a, shall I say, a soft spot in my heart for librarians and the
Well,
work they do to encourage intellectual freedom,
yeah,
both
they're now an embattled group. But so
a very embattled group.
yeah, let me just close this by saying this issue is for my money, the big issue. This does not gainsay lots of other issues. But if you can't, I have been shocked. This is why I wanted to do this. Why at SheerPost we're going to devote a lot of energy to this issue of academic freedom. If you can shut up this generation of college students, not just at the elite schools, but at community colleges, most Americans know they've got to go on to post high school education. But we're also talking about academic freedom for high schools. This is the place where America comes alive in terms of freedom. If you don't get it somewhere in the schooling system, but you didn't get it at home, you didn't get it in your local this, you didn't get it there, if it doesn't happen in your course of education, it probably won't happen. And when it doesn't happen, that doesn't mean you're not going to grow up concerned and angry and so forth. But one reason a lot of people go for somebody like Donald Trump is that they have never heard an alternative explanation for the failures and issues that concern their lives. So that's why, and even in Hitler, that's the big lesson. We haven't really talked about it. Hitler was able to say to working people in Germany and farmers, you're being screwed because of gypsies and Jews and homosexuals. And what is happening now? Because the Democratic Party throw this in as a little footnote or editorial, basically has been co-opted by an elite that is not that different from the Republican Party, and they don't explain to Americans who are in that say 50% that has no more wealth collectively than three super rich billionaires. They don't explain there are alternative explanations of their unhappiness. And when they don't have that, they fall for the argument of suppression of any of the dissenters. So this issue is not going away. I want to thank you, Henry Richmond, for being his advocate for freedom so effectively. I want to thank Joshua Shear, our producer, who once again found our speaker, even though I should have been much more aware of your work. And I belong to the AAUP, by the way. I signed up about a year or two ago. But I want to thank Josh for really pushing that we do this. Diego Ramos, who's somebody who graduated from USC and was very active as a student journalist, who is our managing editor. And Max Jones has a similar background of having been a very involved student who now is Chris Hedges' producer on his television show and puts our video up. So see you next week with another edition of Sheer Intelligence. So